Elections Ontario, which is the governing body that oversees the election, the provincial election, has made some interesting changes or brought in some new measures to help perhaps gain confidence of voters to maybe encourage more voting. Elliot, why don't you walk us through some of these changes and how you think they might impact the results or the voters?
Yeah, well, I guess starting off, I think anything that we can do to make voting easier and more accessible and to encourage democracy, for me, is a good thing. And so I see some of the steps that Elections Ontario are taking as very positive. So extending advanced polling days, I think they're doubling them from 5 to 10 days. That's a good thing. I think they're looking to really get their mail-in ballot process quite formalized and quite tight to be able to respond to what is expected to be, I would imagine, an increase if it follows any of the trends from the federal election that we had last year. To me, these are all good positive steps. We should make it easier for people to vote, whether it's sort of easier for elderly or whatever the case is. So I'm encouraged by the steps that Elections Ontario is taking. It'll be interesting to see if we do see the same kind of pickup on mail-in ballots, or has the pandemic sort of passed people by, or at least we've gotten over the pandemic where people feel much more comfortable returning to an indoor setting, in-person voting.
Okay, Yanni, your take on these new measures?
I think the first big point that stood out to me from Elections Ontario was the fact that voters can now register on their phones through their apps and to receive voting information not by mail as we have traditionally, but through a text message notification or through an email, which I think really speaks to the younger demographic that generally doesn't show up to vote as often as those in the 30 plus bracket. So that's one thing that really stood out to me. But I think my biggest concern with this whole mail-in ballot thing was, 1.2 million Canadians in the federal election in 2021 had requested mail-in ballots, and of that, 205,000 went uncounted. So what does that mean for Ontario? I don't know. I think Elections Ontario is probably working with Elections Canada to see where their shortcomings were, and certainly is working to avoid making the same mistakes.
So I remember that time about the mail-in ballots, because that was in, I don't know, the fourth wave of COVID, I think. And during that time, I remember there was a lot of hoopla about, or a lot of noise being made about how we had this robust program. There would be a lot of opportunities for these mail-in ballots. The process seemed a little bit complicated and onerous. But there was a lot of effort made to I guess, enfranchise people, to get them engaged. But then you're right, there were a couple 100,000 that were simply not counted, which is sad because, in certain races, I'm sure that could have been made the decision in certain races, who knows. My concern when it comes down to mail-in ballot, and why I always prefer voting in person, and I always have, is I like the identification verification. There seems to be less room for voter fraud. And whether we like it or not, voter fraud exists. It happens in every election. Maybe not to the degree that it happens south of the border in some of the counties in America, but we do have voter fraud. So my concerns are what kind of measures will be put in place with mail-in ballots to ensure that the right person who's allowed to vote is actually voting. Any thoughts on that, Elliot?
Well, I would say that there is very, 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 very low voter fraud in Canada. I would just make that abundantly clear. It's just something that, if it does happen, it in no way, shape, or form impacts the outcome of any races. Now, with that said, I do take your point that verifying ID is hugely important, whether it's in person or mail-in, or in the mail-in format. I think Elections Ontario is probably, as Yanni said, learning from the federal election and improving some of their processes. And so, this can always be improved. We can always improve. We can always improve our processes when it comes to mail-in. I think that we can always improve our processes for in-person as well. Make Absolutely. It easier to vote, shorter lines, and that's what I think Elections Ontario is trying to do here: is make it easier for more people to vote over a longer period of time, so we get more engagement.
Yes, and I really appreciate them doubling the amount of advanced polling days, because let's face it, not everybody's available on a specific day. So that's a very good measure. We're going to head to commercial in just a few moments. The reason we're talking about an increase in mail-in ballots rather, is because, we've just kind of come out of COVID, and there are many Canadians who are still, or many Ontarians rather, who are still very concerned about coming in person. And I want to talk about some of the opposition parties who are suggesting that, how we can navigate this election in the shadow of COVID. And we're going to talk about that in just a few moments when we return.